Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The manila folder on my desk shouldn't exist. That's what I keep telling myself as I stare at it. Thick, weathered edges curling up like dying leaves. The label reads, Friday Visits, Unborn Cases. My supervisor, Janet, dropped it off this morning with that same tight smile she always wears, the one that never quite reaches her eyes. "Sarah," she said, placing her hand on my shoulder, "you've been with Child Protective Services for what, 3 years now?" 3.5, I corrected, already sensing where this was heading. "Good, then you're ready for the Friday rounds. Before you think I'm crazy, before you close this video and move on to something else, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you is real, every word. And if you're listening to this late at night, maybe with your headphones on, trying to fall asleep, well, you might want to turn on a light. Because once you know about the Friday visits, you can't unknow them. And now, the story begins. The thing about working for CPS in Portland, Maine, is that you think you've seen everything. Neglected kids living in houses with no heat during February blizzards. Parents too strung out to remember they have children. The worst of humanity laid bare in case files and court documents. But the Friday visits, nobody talks about those. I found out why when I opened that folder. The first page looked normal enough. Standard intake form. Address, 11247 Brackett Street, Apartment 3B. But where the child's name should be, there was just a series of numbers. 2019, 10, 15, NB. Never born. October 15th, 2019. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped to the case notes. The handwriting changed every few entries. Different social workers over the years, but the reports were always the same. Child appears healthy. No signs of distress. Environment suitable. Toys remain in same position as last visit. Child does not interact. Mother continues to maintain nursery. Recommend continued monitoring. I looked up at Janet, who was still standing in my doorway. I don't understand. These are cases for children who were never born? She nodded slowly. Stillbirths. Miscarriages, the ones that almost made it. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. The ones that still need checking on. That doesn't make any sense, Sarah. Her tone sharpened. Every social worker in this office has done the Friday rounds. It's part of the job, non-negotiable. You visit the addresses, you fill out the forms, you don't ask questions. She paused at the door. And Sarah, you never, ever touch anything in those rooms. The rest of that Thursday crawled by. I couldn't focus on my regular cases, kept flipping through that folder. 15 addresses, 15 children who were never born. Each file contained photos of empty nurseries, cribs with untouched sheets, toys arranged just so. But in every photo, something felt wrong. Like looking at a room through frosted glass. Everything slightly out of focus except for the shadows. In each photo, no matter the angle or lighting, there were small shadows. Child-sized shadows. Standing by the cribs. Sitting on the floor with the toys. Shadows with no source. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty rooms. Heard something that sounded like crying, but not quite. More like an echo of crying, the memory of sound. Friday morning came too soon. I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic outside the first address, 1247 Brackett Street, for 20 minutes before working up the courage to go inside. The building was one of those converted Victorian houses you see all over Portland's West End. Beautiful from the outside, probably worth a fortune. But something about it felt cold, even with the September sun beating down. The hallway to apartment 3B smelled like vanilla candles and old carpet. Normal. Completely normal. I knocked 3 times. "Come in," a voice called. "It's unlocked." The woman who answered looked exactly like her file photo. Rebecca Morrison, 34 years old. Lost her baby at 8 months. That was 4 years ago. "You must be the new Friday worker," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Sarah, right?" I nodded, throat suddenly dry. "Tommy's room is down the hall. Second door on the left." She turned back to the kitchen. "I'll make tea." Tommy. She'd named him Tommy. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should. My footsteps echoed wrong, like there were 2 sets of feet walking. The door to Tommy's room was painted bright blue, with wooden letters spelling out his name. Tommy. The M's were slightly crooked. I pushed open the door and froze. The nursery was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Crib with rocket ship sheets, mobile spinning slowly despite no breeze. Toys scattered on a playmat like a child had just been playing. But the room was cold, so cold I could see my breath. And in the corner, by the window, a shadow, small, child-shaped, watching me. I blinked and it was gone. Just trick of the light. Had to be. I pulled out my forms, hand shaking as I wrote, "Environment suitable, no signs of distress." But as I turned to leave, I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible. Giggling. By the 5th house, I'd noticed the pattern. Every mother, and they were always mothers, never fathers, had the same hollow look in their eyes, like they were seeing something I couldn't, or maybe wouldn't. They all made tea. They all directed me to the rooms without following. And they all said the exact same thing when I left. "See you next month." Not goodbye, not thank you for coming, always, "See you next month." The 6th address broke me. It was in Scarborough, just outside Portland proper. A small ranch house with an American flag out front and one of those wooden signs that said "The Johnsons" in cursive letters. Normal, so painfully normal, but the woman who answered the door, she was young, maybe 22. Her file said the baby, a girl named Emma, was never born 3 months ago. Fresh case. But this woman looked like she'd aged 20 years in those 3 months. Hair gone gray at the temples, hands that shook constantly, and her eyes kept darting to something behind me, following something I couldn't see. "Emma's room," she whispered, pointing down the hall. "Please, please don't wake her." The room was pink, soft, baby pink with white trim, a crib in the corner with a mobile of butterflies. And on the changing table, the baby monitor was on. The screen showed the crib, the empty crib, but the sound, breathing, soft, rhythmic baby breathing coming through the speaker. I grabbed the monitor, hands trembling, and looked closer at the screen. The crib was empty, completely empty. But the mattress had an indent. A small, baby-sized indent, like something invisible was lying there. Something touched my shoulder. I spun around, nothing. The room was empty, but now I could smell it. Baby powder, fresh, like someone had just changed a diaper. I ran, dropped my clipboard, left my pen, and ran. The mother didn't try to stop me, just stood in the doorway, that hollow look in her eyes, and said, "See you next month." I made it to my car and called Janet immediately. "I can't do this," I gasped into the phone. "Something's wrong with these houses, these mothers. They're seeing things that aren't there." "Are they?" Janet's voice was calm, too calm. "Or are you just not seeing what is there?" "Janet, please. Finish the rounds, Sarah. All 15 houses. It's important." "Why? Why is it important to check on children who were never born?" The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, very softly, "Because they're still waiting, Sarah. They're still waiting to be born. And someone needs to make sure they stay that way." She hung up. I sat in my car for an hour, watching the house, trying to make sense of what she'd said. And then I saw it, in the window of Emma's room. A shadow, small, moving, playing with something I couldn't see. And behind it, another shadow, adult-sized, sitting in what must be a rocking chair. Rocking back and forth, back and forth. The mother, sitting in an empty room, rocking an invisible baby. Or maybe not so invisible. House number 10 changed everything. It was in Cape Elizabeth, right on the coast. One of those massive colonials with ocean views that tech money had bought up. The kind of place where everything should be perfect. But perfection, I was learning, was where these things like to hide. The woman who answered was different. Professional blazer. Hair pulled back in a tight bun. Eyes clear and focused. Her name was Dr. Patricia Chen, and according to the file, she'd lost twins 7 years ago. "You're early," she said, checking her watch. "The others usually don't come until after 3. "The others?" She studied me for a moment. "You're new to Fridays." It wasn't a question. "First day," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "Come in. But not to their room, not yet. We need to talk first." She led me to a home office lined with medical journals, psychiatry, neurology, and others with titles I didn't recognize. Journals of liminal studies, consciousness and quantum reality, the kind of academic writing that made my head spin. "Tea?" she offered. "Everyone offers tea." "It helps," she said simply, pouring 2 cups, "with the seeing." I don't understand any of this. Dr. Chen sat across from me, hands wrapped around her mug. "What do you know about quantum consciousness?" "Nothing." In simple terms, consciousness, the observer, collapses possibility into reality. We see a thing, and it becomes real. But what happens to the consciousness that never fully forms? The ones that almost were? I stared at her. "My twins," she continued, "were alive for 6 minutes. 6 minutes in this world before their lungs failed. But for those 6 minutes, they existed. They had consciousness, awareness, and when they died..." She paused. "Where did that consciousness go?" "I don't..." "It stayed, Sarah. It stayed because I couldn't let go. None of us could. We kept their rooms, kept their clothes, kept believing, hoping, observing. And our observation, our refusal to accept the empty rooms, it kept them here, trapped between being and not being." My teacup rattled against the saucer as my hands shook. "That's not possible, isn't it?" She stood, walking to the window. "Every Friday, a social worker comes, files a report saying the children are fine. The state's official documentation that these children exist. Legal papers, government recognition, and that recognition, that observation by the system itself, it makes them more real. Why are you telling me this?" She turned back, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. "Because it's getting stronger. They're getting stronger. At first, it was just the shadows, then the sounds. Now..." She pulled up her sleeve. Small bruises covered her arm. Tiny handprints. "They want to be born, Sarah. Fully born. And they're getting angry that we can't give them what they want." A crash came from upstairs. Then another. The sound of toys being thrown against walls. "I should go check on them," Dr. Chen said calmly, like this was normal. "You can see yourself out, and Sarah, whatever you do, finish the rounds. All 15 houses. If you don't..." "What happens if I don't?" "They follow you home." She disappeared upstairs, and I heard her voice, soft and soothing. "Mommy's here. It's okay. Mommy's here." I left, but as I reached my car, I looked back at the house. In the upstairs window, 3 shadows. 2 small, 1 adult. But Dr. Chen lived alone. The twins had no father listed in the file. The twins had never been born. But there they were, playing, as real as shadows could be. I should have stopped, should have driven home, quit my job, moved to another state. But Dr. Chen's words echoed. They follow you home. So I kept going. Houses 11 through 14 blurred together, each one colder than the last, each shadow more defined. By house 14, I could make out features. The curve of a cheek, the reach of small arms, the turn of a head following my movements. They were becoming real, and I was helping it happen. The 15th house wasn't on any map. The GPS kept recalculating, leading me down roads I'd never seen despite living in Portland my whole life. Roads that shouldn't exist. Until finally, I found it. A small cottage at the end of a dirt path, surrounded by trees so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. No name on the file, just an address and a date, 19/7/08/15 NB, 37 years ago. The door was already open. Inside, the cottage was frozen in time. 80s furniture, wood paneling, a kitchen with avocado green appliances, and dust. Layers and layers of dust on everything. Everything except the nursery. The nursery was spotless, pristine, like someone had just cleaned it moments ago. But it wasn't just one crib. The room was filled with them, dozens of cribs, each with a mobile spinning, each with an indent in the mattress. And in the center of the room, an old woman in a rocking chair. She looked up as I entered, and I recognized her immediately. Janet, but older. Much older. Like she'd aged 50 years overnight. "You came," she said, voice barely a whisper. "Good, they've been waiting." "Janet, what is this place?" "The first house," she replied, still rocking. "Where it all started. My daughter. She was never born. August 15th, 1987. But I couldn't let go. Couldn't accept the empty room. So I kept visiting, kept checking. And then I found other mothers who couldn't let go. I created the Friday rounds. The temperature dropped so fast I could see ice forming on the windows. "I thought I was helping," Janet continued, "giving them recognition, existence. But I didn't understand. They don't just want to exist in the shadows. They want to be born, truly born, and they need someone living, to trade places." The shadows began to move. All of them. Dozens of child-shaped shadows crawling out of the cribs, moving toward me. "That's why we need the new social workers," Janet said, standing up. But as she stood, she flickered, like a bad TV signal. "Fresh observers, strong life force, someone who hasn't been worn down by years of visits." "You're not real," I gasped, backing toward the door. "You're one of them." She smiled, that same tight smile from yesterday. "I haven't been real for 3 years, Sarah. None of us have. The supervisors, the senior staff. We're all Friday cases now, checking on ourselves, maintaining the system." The shadows were closer now. I could hear them. Not crying. Laughing. The sound of children playing. Children who wanted to play forever. "But you can stop it," Janet said, her form flickering more rapidly. "Break the pattern. Don't file the reports. Don't complete the rounds. Let us go." "But you said they'd follow me home." "They will. But only if you run. Stay. Face them. Tell them the truth." "What truth?" "That they were loved, that they were wanted, but that they were never meant to be." The shadows stopped. Waiting. Watching. I thought about all those mothers, the hollow eyes, the shaking hands, the desperate need to believe their children existed. And I thought about these shadows, these almost children, trapped between existence and void. "You were loved," I said to the room, my voice shaking. "All of you. Your mothers loved you so much they couldn't let go. But love, real love, sometimes means saying goodbye." The spinning mobiles slowed. The shadows wavered. "You were never born," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "But you were real. For moments. For heartbeats. You existed in hope and dreams and possibility. That's enough. That has to be enough." One by one, the shadows began to fade. Not disappearing, just softening, becoming lighter. And as they faded, I heard them. Not crying, not laughing, sighing. The sound of finally being able to rest. Janet was the last to go. As she faded, she looked younger, like the woman who'd hired me 3 years ago, like the mother she'd been before grief froze her in time. "Thank you," she whispered. And then I was alone, in an empty cottage, surrounded by dust and silence. I drove back to the office in a daze. The building was different, smaller. A note on the door said CPS had moved to a new location in 2021. 3 years ago. I called the number. A woman answered, a real woman with a tired voice and the sound of phones ringing in the background. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said. "I worked for CPS." "Sarah Mitchell." She sounded confused. "We have a Sarah Mitchell in our records, but she died 3 years ago. Car accident, the same day she was supposed to start." I hung up, but I didn't go home. Not yet. Something nagged at me. The first house I'd visited. Rebecca Morrison and Tommy. I needed to see if she was real. 2147. Brackett Street looked different in the late afternoon light. Warmer somehow. More alive. I knocked on apartment 3B. Rebecca answered, but she looked different. Healthier. The hollow look was gone from her eyes. Behind her, I could hear the sound of children playing. Real children, living children. "Sarah?" She seemed surprised to see me. "I didn't expect—" "Wait, how do you know my name?" I was here this morning, for Tommy's room." Her expression changed. Confusion mixed with something that might have been relief. "Tommy's room?" She turned toward the hallway, then back to me. "There hasn't been a Tommy's room for months. I converted it. Finally, it's my home office now." She invited me in, and I could see it was true. The nursery was gone. In its place, a bright office with a computer and filing cabinets. Photos on the wall showed Rebecca with a man I hadn't seen before. Wedding photos, vacation pictures, life moving forward. I thought I had, she struggled with the words. After I lost the baby, I kept his room exactly as it was, for 4 years. But then one day, I woke up and realized he was gone. Really gone, and I was still here, still living. I needed to live. What changed your mind? The strangest thing. I had this dream. This woman. She looked like you, actually. Told me it was okay to let go. That love doesn't mean holding on forever. It means accepting what is and what isn't. I left Rebecca's apartment with my head spinning. If she was real now, if Tommy's room was gone, then what had I experienced that morning? What had any of us experienced? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check the others. I spent the next week visiting every address from the folder. What I found challenged everything I thought I understood about what had happened. Emma's mother in Scarborough was gardening in her front yard. She looked healthy, vibrant. When I asked about Emma, she smiled sadly but peacefully. "I planted a garden for her," she said. gesturing to a small memorial plot with a headstone no bigger than a book. It helps, having somewhere real to visit, instead of pretending she's still. Dr. Chen's house was bustling with activity. A children's birthday party in the backyard. I watched from my car as she laughed with what appeared to be her very much alive twins. When she saw me, she waved me over. "Sarah, right? From the grief counseling group?" She looked confused. "I don't remember giving you my address." "You're twins," I gestured toward the children. "Adopted," she said, beaming. "After I lost my first pregnancy, my husband and I went through years of fertility treatments. Nothing worked. But then we realized there are so many children who need homes. We adopted Marcus and Lucy 3 years ago. Best decision we ever made." Every house told the same story. The mothers were real. Their lost children were really gone. But they had moved on, healed, found ways to honor their loss without being trapped by it. So, what had I seen in those Friday rounds? What had we all seen? The answer came from an unexpected source. A letter in my mailbox, written in my own handwriting. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then you figured out the first part. The Friday rounds weren't about checking on dead children. They were about checking on the living, on us. The CPS office closed 3 years ago when the Friday program was exposed. Turns out, it wasn't sanctioned by the state. It wasn't official at all. It was a support network created by a grief counselor named Janet Morrison, who lost her own daughter. She recruited social workers who had their own losses, who understood the pain. But something went wrong with the program. Instead of helping people heal, it became a way to avoid healing, to stay trapped in grief. The Friday rounds were supposed to help mothers process their loss gradually. Instead, they became a way to never process it at all. When the program was shut down, some of us couldn't let go. We kept coming back, kept performing the rituals. But the mothers had moved on. They'd healed. The only ones trapped in that cycle were us. You died in a car accident on your way to your first day at CPS. But some part of you, the part that wanted to help, that couldn't bear the thought of abandoned children, that part couldn't rest. So you joined the Friday program. Not as an employee, but as a client. Every Friday, you checked on the version of reality where those children needed checking on, where their mothers couldn't heal, where your job still mattered. Because the alternative, the truth that you never got to help anyone, that you died before you could make a difference, was too painful to accept. The other social workers in the program were the same. All of us lost something. All of us died, in one way or another, before we could finish what we started. So we created a reality where our work was still needed. But tonight, when you told those shadows they were loved but needed to rest, you weren't just talking to them. You were talking to all of us, to yourself. It's time to let go, Sarah. The mothers are fine. They've healed. Their children are at peace. And now, so can you. With love and understanding, Sarah. P.S. The manila folder was always empty. You filled it with your own need to be needed. But that need, it's not who you are. Who you are is someone who loved so deeply that not even death could stop you from trying to help. That's beautiful. That's enough. I put the letter down with shaking hands. Around me, my apartment began to change. The furniture I'd never remembered buying faded. The life I'd built for 3 years as a ghost dissolved like morning mist. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time in 3 years, or maybe for the first time ever, I felt complete. Through my window, I could see them. Other Friday workers. Other helpers who couldn't let go. They stood on street corners in empty buildings, performing their routines. But one by one, they were beginning to look up. Beginning to see. Janet appeared beside me, but not the flickering version from the cottage. The real Janet. Young again, peaceful. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded. "What about the others, the ones still trapped?" Every story like yours helps free them. Every person who reads about the Friday rounds and understands the real message. It weakens the cycle. Some of them are already waking up. The rest will, in time. And the mothers? The real ones. They're living their lives. They've taken the love they had for their lost children and found ways to share it with the world. Some volunteer at children's hospitals. Others adopt. Some become teachers or counselors. Love doesn't disappear when there's no one left to receive it. It finds new homes. I thought about Rebecca with her office full of life, Dr. Chen with her adopted twins, all the real mothers who had found ways to transform their grief into something that helped others heal. That's what we were supposed to do too, wasn't it? I asked. Transform our own losses into help for others. Yes. But we got lost in the wanting to help. We forgot that sometimes the greatest help we can give is knowing when to step back, when to trust that people can heal on their own. The apartment continued to fade around us, but instead of emptiness, I felt fullness, completion, the satisfaction of a job finally finished. Will anyone remember us? I asked. Janet smiled. The best helpers are the ones nobody remembers needing. Their success is measured not in gratitude, but in independence. In the people who get to move on because someone cared enough to show up, do the work, and then let go. As the world dissolved completely, I heard something I hadn't heard in 3 years. Silence. Real silence. Not the desperate quiet of held breath, but the peaceful silence of rest. Epilogue. The real Friday rounds. If you've made it this far, you might be wondering if any of this was real, if the Friday rounds actually exist, if there are social workers checking on children who were never born. The truth is more complicated than that. There are support networks for bereaved parents. There are grief counselors who specialize in pregnancy loss. There are organizations that help families process the loss of children who died before birth or shortly after. These are real, necessary healing services staffed by living people who do incredible work. But sometimes, in the spaces between official programs, other networks form. Groups of people so committed to helping, so unable to accept that their help has limits, that they create their own reality where their services are always needed. They're not malicious. They're not evil. They're helpers who can't stop helping. Fixers who can't accept that some things can't be fixed. Lovers who can't accept that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. If you work in helping professions, if you're a social worker, therapist, nurse, teacher, counselor, pay attention to your own need to be needed. Notice when your desire to help becomes more about you than about the people you're trying to serve. Learn the difference between supporting someone's healing journey and preventing them from taking that journey at all. And if you're someone who has lost a child, born or unborn, know that your grief is valid. Your love is real. Your loss matters. But also know that healing is possible, that moving forward isn't betrayal, that you can honor what was lost without sacrificing what remains. There are no Friday rounds checking on children who were never born. But there are Thursday morning support groups for parents learning to live with loss. There are Tuesday evening therapy sessions for people processing complicated grief. There are Wednesday afternoon volunteer opportunities for those ready to transform their pain into purpose. The real help happens in real time, with real people, in the messy, complicated, beautiful process of healing. It doesn't require supernatural intervention. It just requires showing up, doing the work, and trusting the process. And sometimes, it requires knowing when to step back, when to trust that love, once given, continues to exist even when its original recipient is gone. That the capacity to love and be loved doesn't disappear with loss. It transforms. It finds new homes. It helps others heal. That's the real Friday rounds. Not checking on what's gone, but nurturing what remains. Sweet dreams. See you next month. Actually, no. See you when you're ready. When you've done your own work. When you've healed enough to help others heal without getting lost in the helping. See you when it's time. And that time is up to you. Author's note. This story was inspired by the real experiences of bereaved parents and the dedicated professionals who support them. While the supernatural elements are fictional, the grief, love, and ultimate resilience of people who have lost children is profoundly real. If you or someone you know is struggling with pregnancy loss or infant loss, please reach out to organizations like SHARE, First Candle, or your local hospital's bereavement services. Help is available. Hope is possible. Healing, while never simple, is always within reach. Story number 2. My grandfather's CB radio still sits on my dashboard. Dead silent for 3 years now. Until tonight. The static broke at exactly 2:47 a.m. with 4 words that made my blood freeze. "Don't stop there, kid." The voice was his. I know that's impossible. Grandpa Joe died hauling steel through these mountains in 2021. But I'd recognize that gravel-rough Tennessee drawl anywhere. And he only ever warned me about one place. Before you think I'm crazy, let me ask you something. Have you ever driven Interstate 77 through southern West Virginia at night? That stretch between Beckley and Princeton where the mountains press so close you can't see the stars? Where your radio cuts to static and your phone shows no service for 40 miles straight? If you have, then you've passed it. Mile marker 23. The last Appalachian rest stop. And if you're smart, you kept driving. The story begins now. I never meant to stop there. Nobody ever does. My name's Marcus Webb, and I've been driving trucks for 7 years now. Started when I was 21, right after Grandpa Joe's funeral. He left me his old Peterbilt and a notebook full of routes, delivery contacts, and warnings. Page after page of which truck stops had the best coffee, which way stations to avoid on Fridays, and circled 3 times in red ink. Mile 23, never stop. Never. For 3 years, I listened, filled up in Beckley or pushed through to Princeton, planned my routes so I'd never need to stop in that 40-mile dead zone. Other truckers do the same, though nobody talks about why. It's like an unspoken rule. You just don't stop at mile 23. But I should have paid more attention to Grandpa Joe's other warnings, the ones scattered throughout that notebook like breadcrumbs. Things I dismissed as an old man's superstitions, like the page about the collection routes, certain highways where drivers just vanished, not crashes, not breakdowns, just gone. Their trucks found idling on the shoulder, doors open, keys still in the ignition, or the list of names. 43 drivers over 30 years, all last seen on Interstate 77, all between mile markers 20 and 25. When I first read it, I figured it was just Grandpa Joe being morbid, keeping track of friends who'd died in accidents. But now I wonder, were they really accidents? There was a photo tucked in the back of the notebook, too, black and white, probably from the 70s. Showed that familiar brown brick building I'd drive past every month, the last Appalachian rest stop. But in the photo, it looked different. Wrong somehow. The angles didn't match what I remembered. The building seemed bigger, more windows than it should have. And standing in front of it, a group of people, drivers probably. They all had the same expression, the same blank stare, the same hand position. Tonight, everything went wrong. Started with the storm. October rain in Appalachia isn't like rain anywhere else. It comes sideways, thick as curtains, turns the asphalt into black glass. My wipers couldn't keep up. The defroster fogged my windows from the inside, and I was hauling a full load of furniture to Charlotte. Deadline tomorrow morning. No time for delays. Should have stopped in Beckley, I know that now. but the truck stop there was packed. 20-minute wait for diesel. I figured I could make Princeton easy. My gauge showed a quarter tank, more than enough. Then the engine started coughing, just a little hiccup at first, the kind you ignore. Hope it goes away. But 5 miles out of Beckley, it got worse. The temperature gauge crept toward red. Something was wrong with the cooling system, maybe a leak, maybe worse. But thinking back now, I wonder if the engine trouble was real, or if something was calling me to that place, making sure I'd have no choice but to stop. Because the closer I got to mile marker 23, the worse it got, like the truck itself knew what was waiting. Mile marker 18 passed in the rain. Then 19, 20. The engine knocked, sputtered. The temperature gauge hit red. Mile marker 21. That's when I noticed the silence on the CB. All night there'd been chatter. The usual late-night conversation between drivers trying to stay awake. Complaints about weather, jokes, warnings about speed traps. But as I passed mile marker 21, it all stopped. Not gradual, just silence. Like every trucker on the eastern seaboard had suddenly gone mute. Steam started seeping from under the hood. White wisps in my headlights. Mile marker 22. And then I saw it. That faded blue sign barely visible through the rain. Rest area, 1 mile. My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. But what choice did I have? Blow my engine in the middle of nowhere. Or pull off for 10 minutes, let it cool down, add some water, and get out fast? The exit ramp appeared like a mouth in the darkness. I took it. The moment my tires left the interstate, the rain stopped. Not slowly, not naturally, just stopped, like driving through a curtain into another room. The silence hit harder than the storm had. No rain on the roof, no wind, no static from the CB, just my engine ticking as it cooled and my own breathing. Too loud in the sudden quiet. But there was something else. A sound I couldn't quite identify at first. Low. Rhythmic. Like breathing, but too big to be human. Too slow. Like the mountains themselves were drawing breath. The rest stop sat in a bowl between mountains, lit by those old sodium lights that turn everything orange and sick-looking. One long building, brown brick from the 70s, with men's and women's restrooms on either end and vending machines in the middle. A dozen parking spots for cars, 4 for trucks, all empty except for one. A Freightliner, navy blue, parked at the far end. But now that I was here, I could see details that hadn't been visible from the interstate. The building was wrong. The proportions didn't match my memory. It stretched too far back into the darkness, like it kept going beyond what should have been possible. The brick looked newer in some places, older in others, like it had been built and rebuilt dozens of times, each addition slightly off from the last. The vending machines hummed, but their lights were out. Through the glass, I could see the usual selection of sodas and snacks, but everything looked faded, like the colors had been drained away. I pulled in 3 spaces away. Habit from years of giving other drivers their space killed the engine. The ticking got louder, like finger bones cracking. Steam still rose from my hood, but less now. I'd need to wait at least 20 minutes before adding coolant. 20 minutes at mile marker 23. I grabbed my flashlight, the heavy mag light that doubles as a weapon if needed, and climbed down from the cab. The ground felt wrong under my boots, too soft, like stepping on carpet instead of asphalt. The air tasted stale, recycled, like breathing inside a sealed room, and cold. Much colder than it should have been. My breath misted in the air, but the temperature had been in the 60s when I left Beckley. Now, it felt like winter. The other truck's engine was off, but the running lights glowed. Someone was in there. Maybe sleeping, maybe watching. The windows were too dark to see through. I popped my hood. The radiator hissed like something angry. Definitely a leak. Probably a cracked hose. I had spare coolant, but it would only be a temporary fix. Enough to reach Princeton, though. Enough to get away from here. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the restroom building. A man emerged from the shadows between the vending machines. Tall, maybe 6'4", wearing a flannel shirt that might have been red once but looked brown in the sodium light. Jeans, work boots, the uniform of 1,000 truckers. But his face... Have you ever seen a photograph that's been copied too many times? Where the features blur, become suggestions rather than details. That was his face. I could see he had eyes, a nose, a mouth, but if you asked me to describe them, I couldn't. They kept sliding away from focus. Engine trouble? His voice was normal, too normal, like someone doing an impression of how they think people should sound. Just overheating. I kept my voice steady. Be out of here in a few minutes. He took a step closer. His boots made no sound on the asphalt. That's a nice truck. Peterbilt, 94? 95. Had one just like it once. Good trucks, reliable. He tilted his head, studying my rig. You know, there's a better place to park, around back, more room, better light to work on that radiator. Every instinct screamed no. I'm good here, thanks. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Couldn't, because I still couldn't quite see his eyes. Suit yourself, but you might want to move that truck. This spot, it's got problems, drainage issues. Your friend found that out. My friend? He gestured to the Freightliner. Been here, 3 hours now, maybe 4. Kept saying he'd leave soon. Just needed to rest his eyes a minute. You know how it is. 3 hours. At a rest stop. No trucker stays at a rest stop for 3 hours unless something's wrong. He okay? The man's smile widened, too wide. Why don't you ask him yourself? I looked at the Freightliner. Still no movement. The running lights flickered. Just once. Like a blink. When I turned back, the man was gone. Not walking away. Not behind the building. Gone. Like he'd never been there at all. But I could still smell him. Diesel fuel and something else. Something sweet and cloying. Like flowers left too long in a closed room. I should have left right then. Overheating engine or not, I should have driven until the motor seized. Would have been better than what happened next. But I needed to check on that other driver. Trucker code. You look out for each other. Even in a place like this. Especially in a place like this. I walked to the Freightliner. Flashlight in one hand. Phone in the other. Still no signal. The screen showed the time. 3:23 a.m. Somehow, an hour had passed since I'd pulled off the interstate. That wasn't possible. I'd only been here 10 minutes, 15 at most. The truck's door was unlocked. It opened with a soft click. The smell hit first. Not death. Not exactly. More like absence. Like the air inside had been scrubbed of everything that made it air. Sterile. Empty. The driver sat behind the wheel, a heavy-set man in a cowboy's cap and denim jacket. His hands rested on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead through the windshield. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed from outside. His logbook was open on the passenger seat. I could see the entries. Same route, over and over. Interstate 77, Beckley to Princeton. Same load, same delivery time. The dates went back months. The handwriting got shakier as the pages went on, like he was fighting to write each entry. The last entry was from tonight, but it was wrong. It showed him arriving at mile marker 23 at 11:47 p.m. That was impossible. It was only 3:23 a.m. now. That would mean he'd been here over 4 hours, not 3 like the tall man had said, unless time worked differently here. Hey buddy, I kept my voice calm. "You all right?" He didn't move, didn't blink. I reached out, touched his shoulder. He was cold. Not dead cold, but like he'd been sitting in a freezer. His skin felt waxy, artificial, like a mannequin. He turned his head toward me, slow, mechanical, like a doll on a swivel. I'm just resting my eyes. His lips moved, but the voice came from somewhere else. Behind me, above me, everywhere but his mouth. "Just need a minute. Long drive ahead." "How long you been here?" "Just a minute. Just resting my eyes. Long drive ahead." The same words, the exact same tone. I backed away from the door. His head swiveled back to face forward, hands at 10 and 2. That's when I saw the others, in the car parking area. A Honda Civic with Pennsylvania plates, a woman behind the wheel. Hands at 10 and 2. A Chevy Tahoe from Ohio, family of 4 inside, all facing forward. All with their hands positioned exactly the same, but there were more vehicles than I'd first noticed. An old Ford pickup from the 80s, a minivan with Florida plates, a motorcycle with the rider still straddling it, hands on the grips in the same position. How had I missed them before? And they were all covered in that same thin layer of dust. Not road dust, something finer, like ash, all with their eyes open. My phone buzzed. The screen flickered. For just a second, I had a signal, 1 bar. A text message tried to load from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words appeared before the signal died. "Don't look up." Of course, I looked up. The restroom building's roof was covered in birds, hundreds of them. Crows, maybe, or ravens, too big to be anything else. They sat in perfect rows, silent, all facing the same direction, all watching me. But as I stared, I realized they weren't just birds. Some were too big. Some had the wrong shape. Some had too many eyes. They were perched on power lines that hadn't been there when I'd arrived. The lines stretched away into the darkness, connecting to poles that seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the mountains. One cawed, then another, then all of them at once, a sound like tearing metal. They didn't fly away. They fell, straight down, like someone had turned off whatever held them in the air. They hit the ground around me. Soft thuds on that too soft asphalt, and immediately stood up, walked toward me, not hopping like birds do, walking, on their legs, upright. Some still looked like birds. Others had changed, grown, stretched. Their beaks had become too long, too sharp. Their wings dragged behind them like broken umbrellas. I ran back to my truck, slammed the door, turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. The birds surrounded my truck, standing there, watching with eyes that reflected the sodium lights like coins. But now I could see that some of those eyes were human. Blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, all staring with the same blank expression as the drivers in their vehicles. The CB radio crackled to life. "You should have listened, kid." Grandpa Joe's voice, clear as day. "I'm trying to leave. The engine won't." "Not the engine that's the problem. It's you. You're already looking like them. Can't you tell?" I looked in the mirror. My hands were on the steering wheel. 10 and 2. I couldn't move them, couldn't let go. The rest stop doesn't want your truck, Marcus. It wants drivers, collectors for its collection. You've been here too long, you're already changing. How do I get out? Silence, then. You remember what I taught you about backing up? About using your mirrors? Don't look forward, Marcus. Look back. Drive backward. Don't look at the road ahead, not until you're past mile marker 20. That's insane. So is stopping at mile 23. My hands started to move on their own, turning the wheel, positioning it straight ahead. My eyes wanted to lock forward. It took everything I had to look away, to find the gear shift. I threw it in reverse. The engine roared to life. Driving backward on a mountain road in the dark should have been impossible, but the moment I started reversing, the rest stop began to change. The birds stepped aside, creating a path. The sodium lights flickered and dimmed. The building itself seemed to shift, blur, like it was trying to remember what it was supposed to look like. In my mirrors, I watched the rest stop reveal its true nature. The building stretched and warped, becoming something that hurt to look at directly. The parking lot extended in impossible directions. I caught glimpses of more vehicles, dozens of them, stretching back into the darkness. Cars from decades past. Trucks that looked like they'd been parked there since the 70s. A school bus, a hearse, all with their occupants still inside, all waiting. I kept my eyes on the driver's side mirror, watched the exit ramp approach in reverse. My speedometer showed 15 mph backward, 20, 25. Something slammed into my passenger door. That tall man from before, but not quite. His face had given up pretending to be human. It was just smooth. A mannequin head with dents where features should be. You need to stay. His voice came through the glass, through the metal, through my bones. Everyone stays. It's so much easier when you stay. Another impact, the woman from the Honda Civic. She pressed against my windshield, hands still positioned like she was driving. Her mouth opened and closed. No sound, just the motion, but I could read her lips. Just resting my eyes. Just resting my eyes. Just resting my eyes. More shapes pressed against the truck, the family from the Tahoe, the motorcyclist still straddling his invisible bike. Others I hadn't seen before. They moved like sleepwalkers, like people caught in a dream they couldn't wake from. And behind them all, standing at the edge of the light, more figures watched. These ones were different, older. They wore clothes from different eras. A woman in a 50s dress, a man in a zoot suit, a child in overalls that might have been from the 30s. The original collection, maybe. The ones who'd been here longest. The ones who'd forgotten they were ever anything but part of this place. I hit the exit ramp doing 30 in reverse. The truck lurched, tilted, almost jackknifed, but I held it steady. Grandpa Joe had made me practice backing up for hours when I first started driving. Most important skill a trucker can have, he'd said. Knowing how to back out of trouble. The interstate appeared in my mirror. Empty, dark, beautiful. I swung the wheel hard, felt the trailer start to slide. Corrected just enough. The truck spun, almost graceful, until I faced the right direction on the entrance ramp. That's when I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. The rest stop was gone. Not abandoned, not distant, gone. Just empty mountain and darkness where it had been. But the Freightliner was behind me, gaining fast. The driver's face filled his windshield, that same frozen stare, hands at 10 and 2 even as his truck accelerated. Mile marker 22 flashed by. The Honda Civic joined him. Then the Tahoe. All driving in perfect formation, all gaining. Their headlights formed a constellation of pursuit, growing brighter in my mirrors. Mile marker 21. My radio exploded with voices, dozens of them, all saying the same thing. Just rest your eyes. Just for a minute, long drive ahead. But underneath the voices I could hear something else. Music. An old country song from the 70s. The kind Grandpa Joe used to play, and his voice, singing along. Keep on truckin', boy. Keep on moving. Don't you look back now. Mile marker 20. The voices stopped. The headlights behind me vanished. I was alone on the interstate, rain suddenly hammering my windshield again, like I'd driven back through that curtain. I didn't stop until Princeton, pulled into the Flying J truck stop. Bright lights and normal people and the beautiful smell of diesel and coffee. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the fuel nozzle. The mechanic there looked at my radiator. The hose wasn't cracked, wasn't leaking, nothing wrong with it at all. "You sure it overheated?" he asked. I didn't answer, couldn't, because I'd just noticed the time. 3:47 a.m., same time I'd pulled off the interstate. Like those 90 minutes hadn't happened at all. I made my delivery in Charlotte, on time. Nobody asked about the dents in my passenger door. The security cameras at the furniture warehouse didn't show them anyway. Only I could see them. Only I knew they were there. That was 3 days ago. But the changes didn't stop when I left that place. They followed me home. My apartment felt different when I got back. Smaller. Wrong. The angles of the walls didn't look right. My furniture seemed positioned strangely, like someone had moved everything 2 inches to the left while I was gone. And cold. Always cold now, no matter how high I turned the heat. The dreams started that first night. Not nightmares exactly. Just sitting. Behind the wheel of my truck, hands at 10 and 2, staring at an endless road that never changed. In the dream, I was peaceful, content. There was no need to move, no need to think. Just the road ahead and the gentle idling of the engine. I'd wake with my hands cramped from gripping the bedsheets in that same position. Last night, my CB radio turned on by itself. Different voice this time. A woman. Young. Scared. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm at mile marker 23 and something's wrong with this place. The other drivers, they won't talk to me. They just sit there. Please, if anyone can hear this." I grabbed the handset. Almost answered. Almost told her to run. But then I remembered what Grandpa Joe used to say. Some folks are meant to stop there, Marcus, and some are meant to drive on by. The trick is knowing which one you are. I turned off the radio, unplugged it, went to bed. This morning, I found a note on my windshield. Don't know how it got there. My truck was locked. Alarm never went off. The handwriting was my grandfather's. "You did good, kid, but you came too close. They know you're sent now. Stay off 77. Find other routes. And whatever you do, never mention mile marker 23 to another driver. Some of them aren't drivers anymore. They're recruiting." I'm sharing this story anyway. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it makes me one of them now. Spreading the word. Making people curious. Making them want to see for themselves. But after what I found today, I can't stay silent anymore. I went to the Huntington Public Library. Spent 6 hours going through old newspapers, accident reports, missing persons files. What I found changed everything. The last Appalachian rest stop has been demolished 14 times since 1952. Each time, they find new reasons. Structural problems, environmental concerns, budget cuts, but it keeps coming back. Different contractors, different materials, always the same design, always between mile markers 22 and 24. The disappearances go back further than I thought. 73 years of people vanishing on that stretch of highway. Not just truckers. Families on vacation, salesmen, college kids heading home for the holidays. The reports all say the same thing. Vehicles found abandoned, engines running, no signs of struggle. But here's the part that made my blood freeze. Some of those missing people have been found. Years later. Decades later, still driving. Still on the roads. Other drivers report seeing them. Always on Interstate 77. Always between Beckley and Princeton. Always driving the speed limit in the right lane. Always alone. The descriptions match the missing persons reports perfectly, down to the clothes they were wearing. The only difference, their license plates are always expired, by years. sometimes by decades. And there's something else, something that explains why Grandpa Joe knew to warn me. His name was on one of those reports, Joseph Marcus Webb, reported missing in 1952 while driving a load of coal from Kentucky to Virginia. Vehicle found abandoned at mile marker 23. He was 28 years old. But that's impossible. The Joe Webb I knew lived to be 81. He raised me after my parents died, taught me to drive, left me his truck and his warnings. Unless the man I called grandfather was never really my grandfather at all, unless he was one of them, one of the collected, and somehow he broke free. Somehow he escaped and built a life in the real world, had a family, had a grandson, and spent his whole life making sure I'd never end up like him. The photo from his notebook makes sense now. Those blank faces, that wrong building. He wasn't taking a picture of the rest stop. He was documenting it, keeping track, trying to understand what had happened to him. The notebook itself, those routes, those warnings, those names. It wasn't just advice for a new trucker. It was a map, a guide to all the places like mile marker 23, all the traps waiting along America's highways. Because the last Appalachian rest stop isn't unique. It's just one collection point in a network that stretches across the country. Truck stops that shouldn't exist. Rest areas that appear on no maps. Roadside diners that serve coffee that tastes like nothing and keep their customers forever. I've started mapping them based on Grandpa Joe's notes. 27 locations across 15 states, all with the same pattern. All with the same collection of drivers who just needed to rest their eyes for a minute. Epilogue. The warning. But if you're reading this, if you drive trucks or even just drive those lonely stretches of interstate highway, remember this: the last Appalachian rest stop is still there. Mile marker 23. Waiting between Beckley and Princeton. It's always there, even when it isn't. And every night, the collection grows. Those drivers you pass on the interstate, the ones driving perfect speed in the right lane, never speeding, never slowing, never stopping except at mile marker 23. Look at their hands next time. 10 and 2, always 10 and 2, even when the road curves. I ended up researching mile marker 23 after all this. Couldn't help myself. Found an old newspaper archive from 1978. Headline: Rest stopped to close after string of disappearances. 14 people vanished that year. Truckers mostly. Some families. Cars found empty. Engines running. No sign of struggle. The rest stop was demolished in 1979. The thing is, I have the receipt for my fuel stop in Princeton. Time stamped and everything. Paid with my credit card. The charge shows on my statement. But I also have my GPS log from that night. The company tracks all their trucks. According to the log, I never left the interstate. Never took that exit. The data shows me driving straight through from Beckley to Princeton. No stops. So, which is real? The 90 minutes I remember at a rest stop that doesn't exist, or the computer saying I never stopped at all. I don't know anymore. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving other routes now, staying far from Interstate 77, my CB radio turns on by itself, just static mostly. But sometimes, if I listen close, I can hear them, all those drivers, still sitting at mile marker 23, hands at 10 and 2, waiting. Just resting our eyes, they say. Just for a minute. Long drive ahead. The longest drive. The one that never ends. Because here's the thing about that rest stop. The thing my grandfather knew. The thing I know now. It's not really gone. It's just waiting for you to need it. Waiting for that moment when your engine overheats, or your eyes get heavy, or you just need to stop for a minute. Just a minute. And when you take that exit, when you pull into that empty parking lot, check your mirrors before you get out. Count the cars that were already there. And whatever you do, whatever you see, don't look up. The birds are always watching. They're watching right now. So let me ask you, have you ever driven through southern West Virginia at night? Have you ever passed mile marker 23? Did you notice the exit that shouldn't be there? The one your GPS doesn't show? Or maybe you've stopped there. Maybe you're still there, sitting in your car, hands at 10 and 2, reading this on your phone while you rest your eyes. Just for a minute. Long drive ahead. Story number 3. Listen, before we begin this story, I need you to understand something. What happened in Death Valley last October had nothing to do with the heat. Nothing to do with water. Nothing to do with any of the warnings you've heard before. The park rangers won't tell you about the real rules. They can't. But I can, because I broke them. And somehow, I'm still here to tell you about it. If you're listening to this late at night, maybe you should turn on a light. Just a suggestion. Now, let the story begin. My name is Marcus Chen, and 3 weeks ago I was just another software developer from San Jose, burning through vacation days I'd been hoarding for 2 years. Death Valley wasn't even on my radar until Jake called. "Dude, you gotta come with us." Jake's voice crackled through my AirPods while I was debugging code at 2 a.m. Death Valley. This weekend, Tommy found something. Tommy was Jake's cousin from Bakersfield, one of those guys who spent more time in the desert than in civilization. He worked for the Geological Survey, or at least that's what he told people at barbecues. Death Valley in October? I minimized my IDE. Isn't it still like 100 degrees? That's the thing. Jake paused, and I could hear him typing. Tommy says October is when things get interesting after the summer tourists leave. Something in his tone made me stop scrolling through error logs. Interesting how? He won't say over the phone, just keeps talking about some rules. Says most people don't know about them because, another pause, because most people who learn about them don't come back to share. I should have hung up, should have laughed it off and gone back to my code, but I'd been staring at screens for 18 months straight. And something about Jake's nervous energy infected me. When do we leave? 3 days later. I was packed into Jake's Ram 1500 with him and 2 other guys from our college days. Eddie and Malik. Tommy would meet us at Furnace Creek. The drive from San Jose should have taken 6 hours. It took us 9. Because Eddie kept insisting we stop at every in and out along I-5. The sun was setting when we finally turned onto Highway 190, painting the Panamint Mountains the color of dried blood. That's when Jake turned down the music. Okay, Tommy texted me the rules. Eddie laughed from the back seat. Rules? What is this, Fight Club? But Jake wasn't smiling. He pulled up his phone, squinting at the screen in the dying light. Rule number 1, never camp alone. Always maintain visual contact with at least one other person, especially after midnight. Creepy, Malik muttered. Rule number 2, if you hear your name called from the desert, don't answer. Don't look, just wake the others immediately. The truck got quieter. Rule number 3, the ravens aren't really ravens. Don't feed them, don't photograph them, don't make eye contact. What do you mean they're not ravens? I asked. Jake shrugged. That's all it says. There's more but. Tommy says he'll explain when we get there. We reached Furnace Creek as full darkness fell. The visitor center was closed, but Tommy's Tacoma was parked outside, waiting. He looked different from the last time I'd seen him. Thinner. His eyes kept scanning the horizon even while he hugged Jake. You brought them. He seemed relieved. Good, good. Safety in numbers. Tommy, "What's this about?" Jake asked. "Your texts were intense." Tommy glanced around the empty parking lot, then leaned in close. 2 months ago, I was doing survey work near Badwater Basin. Found something, stone markers, old ones, maybe indigenous, maybe older. They had symbols, warnings. He pulled out his phone, showed us photos of weathered rocks covered in strange markings. I translated what I could. These aren't the usual Death Valley dangers. These are rules for surviving something else. Something else? Eddie's skepticism was obvious. October through November, every year, Death Valley becomes... Tommy struggled for words. Permeable. Things that shouldn't be here are. The indigenous peoples knew. The 49ers who got lost here in 1849. Some of them learned too, the few who made it out. "This is insane," Malik said. "Is it?" Tommy's eyes were deadly serious. "You know how many people go missing in Death Valley each year? Really missing, not found dead from dehydration, just gone?" None of us had an answer. "I've mapped out a camp spot, Telescope Peak Wilderness, far from the tourist areas. If we follow the rules, we'll be fine. We might even see them." "See what?" I asked. Tommy's smile was thin. "The ones who didn't follow the rules." We made camp 12 miles from the nearest paved road. Tommy had chosen a spot in a natural bowl of rocks, protected on 3 sides. The October night was surprisingly cold, maybe 45 degrees. We built a fire and settled in with our sleeping bags arranged in a tight circle. Tommy pulled out a notebook, weathered and filled with cramped handwriting. "Okay, the full rules." He read by firelight. 1 through 3, I already told you. 4, if you find objects that shouldn't be in the desert, modern things, personal items, don't touch them. They're bait. "Bait for what?" Eddie asked. But Tommy kept reading. 5, between 3 and 4 a.m. No matter what you see, stay in your sleeping bag. That's when they count. "Count?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. 6, if someone in the group starts acting wrong, speaking in rhythms, moving too smoothly, that's not them anymore. The real them is lost. Don't follow the copy. "Tommy, this is 7. Tommy continued, ignoring Eddie. "The most important rule. If the stars go out, if the sky turns solid black, close your eyes and count to 300. When you open them, you might be alone. That's okay. The others are probably safe, probably in their own timeline. Wait until sunrise. Everyone returns at sunrise, usually." The fire crackled, somewhere in the distance. A coyote howled, or something that sounded like a coyote. "I'm going to sleep," Eddie announced. "This ghost story stuff is fun, but I'm exhausted." We all settled in, but I couldn't sleep. The stars above were impossibly bright, more than I'd ever seen near San Jose. I lay there listening to the others' breathing slowly deepen. Tommy had insisted we keep the fire going all night, taking shifts to feed it. I had first watch. Around 1 a.m. I heard it. My name. Soft, like wind through rocks, but unmistakably my name. "Marcus?" My whole body went rigid. The voice came from beyond the firelight, from the open side of our rock bowl. "Marcus, come here." It sounded like my mother, but my mother was in Sacramento, sleeping in her apartment, not wandering Death Valley at 1 a.m. I remembered Rule 2. Don't answer, don't look, wake the others. I reached over and shook Jake hard. "What?" he mumbled. "Someone's calling my name," I whispered. Jake shot upright. Tommy was already awake, watching me with those intense eyes. "You didn't answer, did you?" Tommy asked. I shook my head. Good. He threw more wood on the fire, making it blaze higher. "It'll stop soon. They can't hold the voice for long." They? I asked. But Tommy just pointed to my ears. That's when I realized. The voice was still calling. But now it was cycling through different people I knew. My ex-girlfriend, my brother, my college roommate. Each voice perfect. Each one telling me to come out into the dark. After 10 minutes, it stopped. First test passed, Tommy said quietly. Try to sleep, I'll take watch. But I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the desert. And I swear, just at the edge of perception, I could hear footsteps circling our camp, staying just outside the firelight, waiting. At 2:47 a.m., Tommy woke us all. Almost 3, he whispered. Remember, no matter what you see, stay in your sleeping bags. We all lay still. Eddie grumbling but complying. At exactly 3 a.m., the temperature dropped. I could see my breath. And then they came. Figures, walking past our camp. Dozens of them. They looked human, but wrong. Their movements too fluid, like they were underwater. Some wore modern clothes, hiking gear. Others wore older clothing, vintage styles from decades past. One woman in a 1950s dress walked by. Her face turned toward us, but her eyes were just dark holes. They were counting. I could hear them whispering numbers in unison, but not in English, not in any language I recognized. One stopped directly in front of me. It wore a North Face jacket, identical to mine. It had my face, but stretched, like someone had pulled the skin too tight. It looked down at me and smiled with too many teeth. 17, it said in my voice, then moved on. They counted us, all of us, even themselves. When they finished, they walked back into the darkness, single file, disappearing beyond the firelight. But that wasn't all. As the procession ended, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. One of the figures at the back of the line turned around. It was wearing Tommy's exact clothes. Same hiking boots, same worn flannel shirt, same weathered baseball cap. But when it looked at us, its face was blank, featureless, like someone had forgotten to finish sculpting it. It tilted its head at our Tommy, the real Tommy, as if studying him, memorizing. Then it raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a threat, and walked away. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Tommy. "See what?" He was staring after the figures with a strange expression. The one that looked like, "I didn't see anything unusual." Tommy cut me off, but his voice was different, flatter. "They're gone now. That's what matters." At 4 a.m. exactly, the temperature returned to normal. "What the hell was that?" Malik's voice was shaking. "The census," Tommy replied. "They count who's here, who's real, who's not. As long as the numbers match, we're safe." "Match what?" Jake asked. "The number from the night before. If someone extra shows up, or if someone's missing," Tommy trailed off. "That's when things get complicated." But something was wrong with the way he spoke. Too measured, like he was reading lines. Eddie sat up. "I'm done. I want to leave, now." "Can't." Tommy shook his head. "Not until sunrise, Rule 8. Which I didn't mention, never travel the valley at night during October. The roads don't lead where they should." "This is insane." Eddie stood up. "Sit down," Tommy hissed. But it was too late. The stars went out. One moment, the Milky Way blazed above us. The next, absolute blackness, like someone had thrown a blanket over the entire sky. "Close your eyes," Tommy shouted. "Count to 300, now!" I squeezed my eyes shut and started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, I could hear the others counting too. But their voices seemed to be getting farther away. By 50, Mississippi. I could only hear my own voice. By 100. The ground beneath me felt different. Softer by 200. The temperature had changed, warmer. By 2:50, I smelled something wrong, like copper and ozone. At 300, I opened my eyes. I was alone. The fire was gone. The rocks were the same, but different. Older somehow, worn smooth in places that had been jagged before. My sleeping bag lay on sand now, not the gravelly surface from before. "Jake?" My voice echoed wrong, like the space was bigger than it should be. "Tommy? Malik?" Silence. I stood up. My phone had no signal, but the screen showed 4:17 a.m. The stars were back, but different. Constellations I didn't recognize, and 2 moons hung in the sky where one should be. No, not 2 moons. I looked closer. One was the moon. The other was something else, spherical, but covered in what looked like geometric patterns. Artificial. I remembered Tommy's words. Wait until sunrise. Everyone returns at sunrise, usually. Usually. I sat back down on my sleeping bag, trying not to panic. The desert around me looked the same but felt fundamentally wrong. Like looking at a picture of your house where someone had moved all the furniture 3 inches to the left. Then I heard footsteps. Not the fluid movement of those things from 3 a.m., regular. Human footsteps. Stumbling, exhausted. A figure emerged from the darkness. A man in vintage clothing. Canvas pants, suspenders, a hat that belonged in a museum. His face was sunburned and desperate. "Water," he croaked. "Please, water." I reached for my bottle, then stopped. This felt like a test. Another rule Tommy hadn't mentioned. The man fell to his knees. "Please, we've been walking for days. The valley, it won't let us leave." "We?" I asked. He gestured behind him, and more figures stumbled into view. Men and women in 1800s clothing. The 49ers. The original Death Valley victims. Still here, still lost. "How long have you been walking?" I asked. The man looked at me with hollow eyes. "What year is it?" 2024. He laughed, broken and horrible. Then, 175 years, give or take. I backed away. These weren't ghosts. They were still alive, somehow. Death Valley had kept them, preserved them in this other space. "The rules," the man gasped. "We didn't know the rules. Came in October. The valley took us, keeps us. Walking, always walking, never aging, never dying, never leaving. There has to be a way out." "Sunrise," a woman in the group said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Real sunrise, not the false ones. You can tell the difference. Real sunrise hurts them." "Hurts who?" She pointed behind me. I turned. The things from 3 a.m. were back. Dozens of them, standing at the edge of my vision. Watching. But now I could see them clearly. They weren't copies of people. They were failed attempts. Like someone had tried to recreate humans from memory and gotten the details wrong. Too many joints in their arms. Faces that shifted when you weren't looking directly at them. They wore the clothes of everyone who'd gotten lost here. Different eras. Different styles. All wrong. But what terrified me most was that I recognized some of the clothes. A red jacket that looked exactly like one I'd seen in a missing persons poster at the visitor center. Hiking boots identical to ones worn by a family who'd disappeared 2 summers ago. A backpack that belonged to a college student who'd vanished while rock climbing. They were wearing the skins of the lost. "They collect us," the 49er said. "Study us, try to become us, but they can't get it right, can't understand what makes us, us." One of the things stepped forward. It wore modern hiking gear, REI, Patagonia, but its movement was all wrong. Like a marionette operated by someone who'd never seen a human walk. "Marcus," it said in Tommy's voice, "come with us. The others are waiting." "That's not Tommy," I said. It tilted its head 90 degrees. "How do you know?" because Tommy would never smile like that. Wide and empty and showing far too many teeth. But then another voice spoke from behind the group of things. Tommy's voice, but different from the first. "Marcus, don't listen to it. I'm the real Tommy. I got separated like you did. I've been looking for you." I turned. Another figure approached. This one looked exactly like Tommy. Same clothes, same mannerisms, even the same way of favoring his left ankle from an old hiking injury. "Which one is real?" I asked the 49ers. "Neither." The woman whispered, "Your friend was taken hours ago. These are just echoes, trying to perfect his form." The two Tommies looked at each other. Then they began to change. Subtly, their faces shifting, becoming more like each other, more perfect. But in that perfection, they lost something essentially human. "The real sunrise?" I asked the 49ers without taking my eyes off the things. "How do you recognize it?" "You'll know," the woman said. "It burns them. They hide. That's your window. Minutes, maybe, before they adapt." The things wearing Tommy's voices stepped closer. More of them emerged, hundreds, all looking at me with those wrong faces. "We just want to understand," they said in unison. "We just want to be real." That's when I understood. Death Valley in October wasn't permeable to let things in. It was permeable to keep things from getting out. These things, whatever they were prisoners here. And every October, they tried to escape by replacing the humans who wandered in. The sky was starting to lighten. False dawn or real, I couldn't tell. The things pressed closer, their faces cycling through every person I'd ever known. Mom, Dad, ex-girlfriends, co-workers, all wrong, all empty. Then pain, actual pain. The sunrise hit the horizon and the things screamed, not with their mouths, but with their whole beings. They writhed and twisted and fled back into the shadows between rocks. "Now!" The 49er grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Run! Back to your timeline. Think of your friends. Picture them clearly." I ran. The sunrise burned brighter than any sunrise should. The landscape blurred, shifted. I could feel reality bending, stretching. I thought of Jake's stupid laugh, Eddie's complaining, Malik's terrible jokes, Tommy's intense eyes. The ground shifted under my feet. The air shimmered. And suddenly, I was back at our campsite. Jake was shaking me. "Marcus, thank God. Where were you?" I looked around. Everyone was there. Eddie, Malik, Tommy, all staring at me with relief and something else. Fear. "How long was I gone?" I asked. 3 hours, Tommy said. "It's 7 a.m. We all came back at sunrise except you. We thought..." He trailed off. "You thought the things got me?" Tommy nodded. I stood up, started packing my gear. "We're leaving," I said. "Now. And we're never coming back in October." "Agreed." Eddie was already stuffing his sleeping bag. As we hiked back to the trucks, I kept checking behind us. The morning sun made everything look normal, safe. But I knew better now. Death Valley was a prison. And every October, the inmates tried to escape. We reached the trucks by noon. As we loaded our gear, Tommy pulled me aside. "What did you see?" he asked. "In the other timeline?" I told him about the 49ers. The things, the false attempts at being human. Tommy's face went pale. "They're getting better at it, every year. More convincing. One day, they'll get it right, and when they do..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We drove out of Death Valley in silence, but just as we reached the park boundary, I saw something in the rearview mirror that made my blood freeze. One of the things, standing by the road sign, wearing my clothes, my face, waving goodbye. Or maybe, "Hello." You'd think that would be the end of it. Drive away, never look back. Pretend it was all some desert hallucination brought on by dehydration and Tommy's ghost stories. That's what Eddie did. He doesn't even talk about that weekend anymore. Just changes the subject. Says he was too drunk to remember clearly. But I couldn't let it go. Neither could Tommy. 2 weeks after we got back, he called me at 3 a.m. I knew it was really him because the first thing he said was, "What did you do in the 3rd grade that got you suspended?" I put a dead fish in Mrs. Patterson's desk drawer. I answered. We'd established these questions. Ways to verify we were really us, not them. Good. Listen, I've been researching. Those stone markers I found, there are more, dozens, all around the valley. They form a pattern. Tommy, we agreed. No more October trips. Not October. December. I need to go back, document them properly. The 49ers you saw, they're still there, still trapped. There has to be a way to... No. I cut him off. Tommy, you can't save them. They've been there for 175 years. They're part of it now. Silence on the line. Then, what if it was Jake? Or you? Would you want someone to try? I didn't have an answer for that. Tommy went back in December. Alone. He sent me texts for the first 3 days. Pictures of stone markers. Translations of symbols, then nothing. His truck was found abandoned at Zabriskie Point on December 19th. No sign of Tommy. The search and rescue teams looked for 2 weeks. Found nothing. The official report listed it as another Death Valley disappearance. Probably fell into a mine shaft. Happens every year. But I knew better. Jake and I drove out there in January. Middle of the day. Stayed on the main roads, at Zabriskie Point. We found his notebook, hidden under a rock where he knew we'd look. The last entry was dated December 15th. They remember me, from October. They know I know the rules. But there are older rules, deeper ones. The stones aren't warnings, they're instructions, for becoming one of them. Voluntarily. The indigenous peoples knew. Some chose to change rather than die when the Europeans came. They're still here, still watching, waiting for others to make the choice. I found the central marker. It's near Badwater, if you're reading this. Don't come looking for me, I'm going to try something. If it works, I'll find a way to contact you. If it doesn't, well, remember the rules. Remember October is their month, and Marcus, check your photos from our trip. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through the pictures from October. Normal shots. Until I got to the group selfie we took at Dante's View. 5 people in the photo, but I only remembered 4 being there. The 5th person, standing slightly behind us, wearing clothes that matched ours but didn't quite fit right. Had Tommy's face, but the eyes... The metadata showed the photo was taken October 3rd. We left on October 5th. Tommy had been replaced 2 days before we even noticed. I still have nightmares about it. About him out there. One of them now. Or maybe trapped like the 49ers, walking forever. Neither human nor whatever they are. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, is what I found when I got home that night. A text from Tommy's number, sent at exactly 3 a.m. The rules have changed. October isn't enough anymore. They're getting stronger. Spring will be interesting. Tell Jake happy birthday. It's coming up, right? March 23rd? Jake's birthday is March 24th. Close, but not quite right. Just like them. I've been researching since then, finding other stories, other places. Death Valley isn't unique. There are spots all over the world where reality gets thin, where things that shouldn't exist do. The Bermuda Triangle, the Bridgewater Triangle, Skinwalker Ranch. All prisons, all failing. And the things inside are learning. The research led me to old mining records. government documents from the 1940s that were classified until recently. Turns out, Death Valley wasn't chosen randomly for those nuclear tests. The government knew something was wrong there. The tests weren't meant to create weapons. They were meant to reinforce whatever was keeping those things contained. It didn't work. Each explosion weakened the barriers, made them more permeable. By the 1960s, the missing persons reports started increasing. By the 1980s, park rangers were quietly reporting impossible sightings, hikers who looked wrong, families who moved too smoothly, children who spoke in perfect unison. Now the barriers are failing completely. October was just the beginning. Soon it'll be year-round. And when that happens, when they figure out how to be perfectly human, they won't need to stay in the desert anymore. They'll walk among us, undetected. Maybe they already are. So, if you're listening to this, late at night, cozy in your bed, remember something. Those sounds outside your window. The ones that almost sound like someone you know calling your name. The footsteps in your hallway that match your roommate's pattern, but are just slightly off. The text from your friend that doesn't quite sound like them. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's your imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, one of them got out. Check your photos, count your friends, verify with questions only they would know. And whatever you do, never go to Death Valley in October. Unless, of course, you want to meet them yourself. They're always recruiting, always watching, always learning to be more like us. And Tommy, if you're somehow listening to this, if any part of you is still you, the fish was actually in Mr. Anderson's drawer, not Mrs. Patterson's, but you already knew that, didn't you? Sweet dreams. Don't forget to check under your bed. And remember, if someone you know starts acting just a little bit wrong, ask them something only they would know. You might be surprised or terrified by the answer, sire. Leave a comment if you've ever noticed someone acting not quite right. And subscribe if you dare for more true stories from places where the rules of reality don't quite apply. The things are watching. They love to read the comments too. Story number 4. Clock strikes 3:33 a.m., and Marcus Chen knew something was wrong. Not because of the flickering fluorescent lights in aisle 7, not because of the automatic doors opening to empty parking lots, but because of what he found in the shopping cart that shouldn't exist. 3 items. Always 3 items. And they spelled out something that made his blood freeze. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you why no one works the overnight shift at Walmart in Millfield, Ohio anymore. And why I'm the last person willing to tell this story. Story begins. My name is Marcus Chen, and I used to think the weirdest thing about working nights at Walmart was finding half-eaten rotisserie chickens hidden behind the motor oil. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing that apparently qualified me for exactly nothing. The overnight stocking position paid decent, $15.50 an hour, which beat my previous job at the movie theater by $3. Millfield's Walmart sat on the edge of town like a beached whale. Fluorescent lights buzzing over endless aisles of everything America could possibly need at any hour. The building had that particular smell. You know the one. Industrial cleaner mixed with new plastic and something vaguely organic you couldn't quite identify. My supervisor, Janet Mills, was a 40-something woman with tired eyes and the kind of permanent slouch that comes from 20 years of retail management. She'd been there since the store opened in 2001, back when Millfield still had a downtown shopping district. "Listen, Marcus," she said during my first shift briefing, adjusting her blue vest with the crooked name tag. "Night shift is different. Customers are different. We get the insomniacs, the shift workers, the people who just can't sleep. Most are harmless, but you'll learn to spot the ones who aren't." She handed me a laminated card with employee protocols. standard stuff mostly, but item 14 caught my attention. If you encounter items arranged in patterns or customers who don't respond to direct questions, immediately contact management. What does that mean? I asked. Janet's expression darkened slightly. You'll understand when you see it. And Marcus, she paused, looking around the empty break room. If you ever see someone shopping alone at exactly 3:33 a.m., just keep stalking. Don't approach them, don't help them, just let them finish and leave. I laughed. Come on, Janet. This isn't some Stephen King novel. She didn't laugh back. The first few nights passed normally enough. I learned the rhythm of overnight retail, the steady hum of refrigeration units, the distant sound of the floor scrubber, the occasional ding of the automatic doors. By midnight, the store emptied except for us employees and the odd customer grabbing late-night essentials. I worked mostly in grocery, restocking shelves with mechanical precision. Canned goods in aisle 3, breakfast cereals in aisle 4. Frozen foods requiring constant vigilance against the Minnesota ice storms that kept knocking out our backup generators. The other overnight crew seemed normal enough. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a college kid like me, saving money for law school. Sarah Kim worked part-time while finishing her nursing degree. Big Mike Henderson had been there for 8 years and knew where every single item in the store was located. But none of them would talk about the 3:33 a.m. thing. Just old Janet being paranoid, Tommy said when I brought it up. But his eyes shifted away when he said it, and he changed the subject to something about the upcoming Bengals game. It was my 4th night when I first noticed the patterns. I was restocking soup cans around 2:15 a.m. when I heard the automatic doors chime. Normal enough. Except when I glanced toward the front of the store, I saw something odd. A shopping cart sat in the main aisle, 3 items arranged in a perfect triangle inside. A box of salt, a pack of birthday candles, and a bag of potting soil. The cart was just sitting there, no customer in sight. I walked toward the front, my footsteps echoing off the polished floors. "Hello?" I called out. "Excuse me, is someone there?" Silence. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby. I approached the cart, examining the items more closely. The salt was regular Morton table salt, nothing unusual. The birthday candles were the cheap, multicolored kind you'd find at any grocery store. The potting soil was Miracle Grow, standard $3 bag. But something about the arrangement bothered me. The items weren't just thrown in the cart, they were placed, deliberately. The salt at one point of the triangle, candles at another, soil at the third. And underneath the cart, barely visible, someone had used white chalk to draw a small circle on the floor. I grabbed my radio. "Janet, this is Marcus. I've got a situation by the entrance." Static crackled for a moment. "What kind of situation?" "Abandoned cart with some items. Looks like someone drew on the floor." A longer pause. "I'll be right there." Janet arrived within minutes, moving faster than I'd ever seen her move. She took one look at the cart and her face went pale. "Don't touch anything," she said, pulling out her phone. "I need to make a call." "Janet, what's going on? It's just some random items." She looked at me with those tired eyes, and I saw something there I hadn't noticed before. Fear. Marcus. In 20 years of working here, I have seen this exact arrangement 43 times. Always at night, always when no customer is around. And every single time, she trailed off, staring at the items. Every single time what? Bad things happen to whoever finds it. Janet made me promise not to mention the cart incident to the other employees. She disposed of the items herself, scrubbed the chalk mark off the floor, and filed some kind of report I wasn't allowed to see. For the rest of that shift, she stayed close to the front of the store, watching the entrance like a security guard. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. 43 times. That was specific. Too specific to be Janet's imagination. The next night, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. During my dinner break, I accessed the employee computer system and started digging through incident reports. My college roommate had taught me a few tricks about navigating databases, and Janet wasn't exactly tech-savvy when it came to password protection. What I found made my sandwich taste like cardboard. Over the past 19 years, there had been 42 documented incidents of suspicious item arrangements at our store. The reports were filed by different managers, different shifts, different employees, but the pattern was always the same: 3 items, geometric arrangement, unexplained appearance, and the timing, always between 3:30 and 3:40 a.m. More disturbing were the follow-up reports. Employees who discovered these arrangements often reported feeling watched during subsequent shifts. Security cameras would malfunction around the time of discoveries, and in several cases, employees quit within a week of finding the items, citing personal reasons or family emergencies. I cross-referenced the dates with local police reports using the public records database. There wasn't a clear pattern, but there were correlations. House fires within a week of incidents. Car accidents involving store employees. One case of a night shift worker named David Palmer who simply disappeared 3 days after filing an incident report about arranged merchandise. I was so absorbed in my research that I didn't notice the time until my break was nearly over. 3:28 a.m. I hurried back to my assigned aisle, but as I passed the main entrance, I saw something that made my heart skip. A customer stood in the pharmacy section completely still, staring at the wall of vitamins and supplements. The customer was a woman, maybe 50 years old, wearing a plain gray coat. Her hair was shoulder-length and brown, and she held a small shopping basket in her left hand. Nothing unusual about any of that, except she wasn't moving at all. I watched for a full minute, and she remained perfectly motionless. Not browsing, not reading labels, just staring. I checked my watch, 3:31 a.m. Following Janet's advice, I tried to ignore the woman and continue stalking, but peripheral vision is a cruel thing. I could see her in my mind even when I wasn't looking directly, standing there, waiting. 3:32 a.m. I risked another glance. The woman had moved, but only slightly. She was now facing the next aisle over, still holding her basket, still perfectly still. And in her basket, I could make out 3 items. 3:33 a.m. The lights flickered. Not unusual for our old electrical system, but the timing sent ice through my veins. When they steadied, the woman was gone. I abandoned my work and walked quickly to where she'd been standing. The aisle was empty, but on the floor where she'd stood, I found 3 drops of water. They formed a small triangle, each drop about 2 inches from the others. I touched one with my finger. It was ice cold. That's when I heard the sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction of the grocery aisles. But here's the thing. I knew the sound of everyone's footsteps on my crew. Tommy wore squeaky sneakers. Sarah's work boots had a distinctive click. Big Mike's heavy footfall was unmistakable. These weren't any of those. I followed the sound, moving through the store like a detective in a noir film. The footsteps stayed just ahead of me, around corners, down aisles I'd already checked. It was like playing hide-and-seek with a ghost. Finally, in aisle 7, the cereal aisle. The footsteps stopped. I turned the corner and found another arrangement. This time, it was different items, but the same pattern. A box of Cheerios, a bottle of vanilla extract, a package of birthday wrapping paper, arranged in a perfect triangle on the floor, not in a cart this time. I stood there staring at the items, trying to process what was happening. That's when I realized the footsteps had started again. Behind me this time. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see the gray-coated woman or some other mysterious figure. Instead, I saw Janet standing at the end of the aisle with a look of grim resignation. "How long have you been watching?" she asked. "Janet, How long, Marcus?" "About 10 minutes. There was a woman. She disappeared, and then I heard footsteps and—" Janet walked toward me, her own footsteps echoing in the empty store. When she reached the triangle of items, she knelt down and began collecting them without hesitation. "This is the 44th time," she said quietly. I was really hoping you wouldn't see it. Janet, what is this? What's really happening here?" She stood up, holding the 3 items. "I wish I knew, Marcus, I really do. But I know enough to understand that this store, our store, is connected to something we don't understand." She looked at me with those tired eyes, and I realized her exhaustion wasn't just from 20 years of retail. It was from 20 years of carrying a secret. "The question is," she continued, "are you going to quit like the others? Or are you going to help me figure out what these things want?" I should have quit. Any rational person would have walked out that night and never looked back. But there's something about a mystery that hooks into your brain like a fish hook. The more you try to ignore it, the deeper it sets. Janet and I formed an unofficial partnership. During slow periods, we'd review old incident reports, trying to find patterns the previous managers had missed. We mapped out the locations where items appeared, the types of objects involved, the timing of each occurrence. What we discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The items weren't random. They followed a logic we didn't understand yet, but there was definitely a system. Salt appeared in 89% of the arrangements. Candles in 67%. Soil or dirt-related items in 78%. But there were other recurring objects, too. Mirrors, batteries, birthday-related items, cleaning supplies. The locations weren't random either. Most incidents occurred in aisles 3, 7, 12, and 15. Always odd-numbered aisles. Always sections that would have been active during the day but were empty during the overnight hours. But the timing was the most consistent factor. 3:33 a.m. plus or minus 3 minutes. Every single documented case. It's like they're following some kind of schedule, Janet observed one night as we pored over printouts in the break room. Like this is, I don't know, routine for them. "Them?" I asked. She looked uncomfortable. "I've seen the woman you described, the one in the gray coat, but she's not the only one. Over the years, there have been others. Always alone, always silent, always shopping for exactly 3 items before disappearing." I felt that familiar chill. "How many others?" "Dozens, Marcus. Dozens of people who shop in our store but don't show up on security cameras, don't pay for their items, don't exist in any way that makes sense." We installed a small security camera in aisle 7, positioned to capture the area where most incidents occurred. Janet had connections with the overnight security company, and she managed to get us access to a spare camera and recording equipment. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The camera recorded hours of empty aisles, fluorescent lighting, and the occasional appearance of one of us doing our normal work. On the 4th night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the camera malfunctioned. Not just malfunctioned. It recorded something impossible. When we reviewed the footage the next morning, we saw the aisle from our camera's perspective. Empty shelves, normal lighting. And then, for exactly 37 seconds, the image showed the aisle filled with people. Dozens of people, all shopping silently. Men and women of various ages, all wearing clothes that seemed slightly out of date. Some pushed shopping carts. Others carried baskets. All of them moved with the same slow, deliberate pace. And every single one of them was selecting 3 items. The footage was grainy, but we could make out faces. The gray-coated woman was there, of course, but so were others. An elderly man in a brown suit, a young woman wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in the 1980s, a teenage boy in a Letterman jacket that featured a high school logo we didn't recognize, They shopped in complete silence, their movements synchronized in a way that seemed almost choreographed. When they finished selecting their items, they all converged at the center of the aisle and arranged their items in groups of 3 on the floor. Then the footage went black for exactly 6 seconds. When the image returned, the aisle was empty again. No people, no items, no trace that anything unusual had happened. "Janet," I said, rewinding the footage for the 5th time, "this is impossible." She nodded, but her expression was more resigned than shocked. "I know, but Marcus, I think we're starting to understand what's happening here." "Are we?" "Think about it. All these people shopping for the same types of items, all appearing at the same time, all leaving arrangements that seem purposeful." I waited for her to continue. "What if they're not trying to scare us? What if they're trying to tell us something?" That night, we decided to conduct an experiment. We would stay in aisle 7 at 3:33 a.m. and see what happened when we were present during an incident. It was probably the stupidest decision either of us had ever made. At 3:30 a.m., Janet and I positioned ourselves at opposite ends of aisle 7. We each had radios, flashlights, and a healthy dose of terror. The store was empty of customers, and the other employees were focused on their sections. 3:31 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. Nothing unusual. 3:32 a.m. I heard Janet's breathing through the radio, quick and shallow. My own heart was beating so hard I was sure she could hear it. 3:33 a.m. The temperature dropped. I'm not talking about a slight chill. I mean the temperature plummeted at least 15 degrees in a matter of seconds. Our breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. And then we weren't alone anymore. They appeared gradually, like images slowly developing on photographic paper. First, just shadows, then outlines, then fully formed people shopping in our aisle. The gray-coated woman was there exactly as I'd seen her before, the elderly man in the brown suit, the young woman in the vintage dress, but now I could see their faces clearly. They all looked peaceful, not menacing or angry or frightening, just sad, deeply, profoundly sad. The woman in the gray coat was selecting a box of salt, just as she had in the camera footage, but as she reached for it, she turned and looked directly at me. Her eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my chest tighten. Recognition. She knew I could see her, and she was grateful. She mouthed something, but I couldn't make out the words. Then she pointed toward the front of the store, toward the customer service, and nodded slowly. All of the figures finished their shopping and converged at the center of the aisle, just as they had in the footage. They arranged their items in groups of 3, forming a larger pattern that I finally understood. It wasn't random, it was a map. The arrangements of items corresponded to locations in our store. Salt for the entrance, candles for the customer service desk, soil for the garden center, mirrors for the pharmacy. Each group of 3 items marked a specific place, and all of those places had one thing in common. They were locations where the store's original building plans showed structural supports that had been removed during renovation. Janet and I spent the next day researching the history of our Walmart location. What we discovered explained everything, and made everything infinitely more complicated. The store wasn't built on empty land. It was built on the site of the old Millfield Community Center, which had served the town from 1962 to 1999. The community center had been demolished to make way for the Walmart, but the demolition had been rushed to meet corporate deadlines. The building had been torn down, but the basement hadn't been properly filled. Instead, construction crews had simply built over it, creating a hollow space beneath the store's foundation. A space that still contained remnants of the community center's basement, including a storage room where the center had kept lost and found items, personal belongings that had never been claimed. items that had been waiting for their owners to return. But here's where the story gets complicated in a way that still gives me chills. The community center's lost and found records, which we found in the Millfield Historical Society's archives, showed exactly 43 people who had lost items in the months before the building was demolished. People who had left behind coats, purses, books, personal mementos, and who had never returned to claim them. The names on the lost and found list matched missing person reports from that same time period. 43 residents of Millfield and surrounding areas who had simply disappeared between 1998 and 99 during the months leading up to the community center's demolition. The gray-coated woman was Margaret Weaver, age 52, who had disappeared on March 15, 1999, after attending a town meeting about the proposed Walmart construction. Her gray winter coat had been found in the community center's lost and found. The elderly man in the brown suit was Robert Chen, my own great-uncle, who had disappeared on January 8, 1999. I had never known him, but family stories mentioned that he had been active in community affairs and had opposed the Walmart construction. 43 people, all connected to the community center, all missing, all shopping in our store at 3:33 a.m. Janet and I realized that the shoppers weren't trying to frighten us. They were trying to show us where their belongings were located. The arrangements of items were maps, pointing to the places in our store that corresponded to locations in the old community center's basement. They wanted their things back. On what would be my final night working at Walmart, Janet and I made a decision that probably violated several corporate policies and possibly some laws. We were going to help them. Using store blueprints and the community center's original floor plans, we identified the exact location beneath our store where the old lost and found room would have been. It corresponded to an area near customer service, where the floor had always seemed slightly unstable. At 3:00 a.m., using a crowbar from the automotive department and a flashlight, we pried up several floor tiles in that area. Beneath the tiles, we found exactly what we expected and dreaded: a hollow space, about 4 feet deep and extending under a significant portion of the store's front section. And at the bottom of that space, partially buried in construction debris, personal belongings, coats and purses and books and photographs, jewelry and wallets and keys. Dozens of items that had been abandoned when the community center was demolished, buried under 20 years of dust and forgotten dreams. We carefully collected everything we could find and arranged the items in the center of the store, near customer service, where the gray-coated woman had pointed. At 3:33 a.m., they appeared one last time. 43 people, shopping in our aisles, selecting their 3 items each. But this time, when they converged at the center of the store, they didn't leave the items on the floor. Instead, each person approached the collection of lost belongings we had arranged, found their personal items, and simply faded away. Margaret Weaver picked up her gray coat, smiled at me with tears in her eyes, and vanished. Robert Chen found his brown wallet, nodded respectfully to both of us, and was gone. One by one, 43 people reclaimed what had been lost, what had been waiting for them beneath our store for over 2 decades. When the last person had faded away, the store felt different. Lighter somehow. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter. The air felt warmer. And we never saw another arrangement of 3 items again. I quit my job at Walmart the next week, not because I was scared, but because the mystery was solved. Janet stayed on for another year before retiring, but she told me the overnight shifts were peaceful after that. No more incidents, no more reports, no more watchers in the aisles. The store donated the remaining unclaimed items to the Millfield Historical Society, where they're now part of an exhibit about the town's lost community center. Most people assume they're just historical artifacts, not knowing the true story of how they were recovered. I never told anyone else what really happened during those nights. Who would believe it? But sometimes when I drive past that Walmart on Route 23, I think about Margaret Weaver and Robert Chen and the 41 others who had been waiting so patiently for someone to help them find their way home. And I wonder, how many other places are built on top of unfinished business? How many other stores and offices and homes are constructed over the remnants of lives that were interrupted? Belongings that were abandoned, stories that were never properly concluded. Maybe that's why some places feel different at night. Maybe that's why certain buildings have that particular atmosphere, that sense of being watched or remembered or quietly haunted by things that refuse to be forgotten. All I know for certain is this. If you ever find yourself in a store at 3:33 a.m. and you see items arranged in patterns that don't make sense, and you encounter shoppers who don't quite seem to belong, maybe don't ignore them. Maybe they're trying to tell you something. Maybe they just want to go home. What do you think really happened in that Walmart basement? Have you ever experienced something similar during late-night shopping trips? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've got your own strange retail stories, I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries that blur the line between reality and the unexplained. Sweet dreams.